The night was dark, cold, and rainy, with the sound of raindrops hitting the pavement in a steady rhythm. Luke, a 14-year-old boy, was soaked through as he wandered the empty streets. In his arms, he held a tiny, shivering newborn wrapped in dirty rags. Luke had found the baby while searching for food in a restaurant's trash bins. He'd been scavenging when he heard a faint cry and followed it to a dark alley. There, he found the abandoned baby, barely alive, its breaths weak and cold. This sight brought back memories for Luke. He knew what it was like to feel unwanted. His parents had left him when he was young, and he'd spent years being shuffled between foster homes, feeling alone and unimportant. But this was different. The baby was helpless, and it reminded him of his little sister, who had died in a fire when they were young. He hadn't been able to save her, and he blamed himself every day. He wouldn't fail again. Holding the baby close, Luke started running through the dark, wet streets. The hospital wasn't far, but to him it felt like miles. When he finally burst through the doors, nobody noticed him at first. The hospital was busy, with doctors and nurses rushing by. Desperate, Luke ran to the front desk and gasped, "Help! Please!" A nurse looked up, surprised. "Where did you get that baby?" she asked, suspicious. "I found him in an alley," Luke replied. "He's not breathing right. You have to help him." Before the nurse could respond, a doctor stepped forward. Her name was Dr. Sarah Williams, the head of the children's unit. She had tired eyes and a serious face, showing no warmth as she looked at Luke and the baby. "Who are you?" she asked coldly. Luke looked down. "I'm nobody," he whispered. "But this baby needs help. He's going to die if you don't help him." Dr. Williams glanced at the baby, but her expression didn't change. "Where are the baby's parents?" she asked, as if this was a routine question. "I don't know," Luke said, his frustration rising. "He was abandoned." Dr. Williams shook her head. "We have protocols. We can't just treat a baby with no information or medical history. It's not that simple." Luke's heart pounded. "What do you mean? This baby is dying. Isn't that more important than some rules?" Dr. Williams's face stayed blank. "Sometimes it's just too late." Luke couldn't believe it. "You're just going to let him die?" he asked, his voice breaking. He searched her face for kindness, but found none. "I'll call social services," Dr. Williams said. "They'll know how to handle this." Luke's blood ran cold. Social services would mean the baby would be taken away, and he himself might be sent back to the foster system he'd escaped. "No!" he cried, stepping back. "I'll take care of him." Dr. Williams looked doubtful. "You? A street kid with no home? How do you plan to care for a baby?" Luke's face turned red. "I'll figure it out," he said firmly. "I won't let him die. Not like my sister." For the first time, Dr. Williams softened slightly. She looked at Luke closely. "Your sister?" she asked. Luke swallowed, fighting back tears. "She died in a fire when I was little. I couldn't save her. I can't lose this baby, too." Dr. Williams looked at him thoughtfully, then quickly returned to her cold demeanor. "I'm sorry," she said, "but there's nothing I can do. I'll call social services." Just then, the hospital doors burst open again, and a man walked in, dripping wet from the rain. He looked anxious as he saw Dr. Williams. "Sarah," he called, his voice trembling. Dr. Williams turned to him, her face pale with shock. What are you doing here?" she asked. The man looked at Luke, then at the baby, his face filled with sadness. "You have to help that baby," he pleaded. "Please, Sarah, you have to do it." Dr. Williams stared at him, her hands shaking. I can't," she whispered. "I can't go through this again." The man stepped closer. "Sarah, don't turn your back on him." Luke watched, feeling confused. He didn't understand their history, but he could see pain in their eyes. Dr. Williams turned to Luke, her gaze softening for the first time. She nodded. "Bring the baby to the exam room," she said. "I'll see what I can do." In the exam room, Luke watched as Dr. Williams prepared the equipment. The man stood nearby, watching her closely, his face filled with worry. Luke couldn't hold back his questions. "Who are you?" he asked. "Why do you care so much?" The man looked at Dr. Williams before answering. "We were married once," he said quietly. Luke was surprised. "Married?" The man nodded, sadness in his eyes. "A long time ago, before things went wrong." Dr. Williams turned, looking angry. "I told you we're done," she said, her voice hard. The man's face tightened. "Sarah, this isn't about us. It's about saving that baby." Dr. Williams's face showed pain. "I know what I have to do," she said, though her voice trembled. Suddenly, the machine connected to the baby beeped. Dr. Williams looked at the screen, her face filling with worry. "His heart rate is dropping," she whispered. Luke's heart raced. "Can't you do something?" he pleaded. "Please, save him." The man stepped closer, his voice urgent. "Sarah, you know what you have to do. Try the surgery." Dr. Williams froze, looking afraid. "No," she said softly. "That surgery is too risky. I can't." Luke felt frustrated. "Why not? If it can save him, why won't you try?" Dr. Williams looked at him, her eyes filled with pain. "Because I tried this surgery once before," she said, her voice shaking, "and it didn't work. I lost my son." Luke's heart sank. "Your son?" he whispered. Dr. Williams nodded, tears in her eyes. "Yes. My son had the same condition. I tried to save him, but he didn't make it." Luke understood now. Dr. Williams was scared because she had tried and failed before. But now, maybe she would try again, giving this baby a chance. Luke's stomach hurt badly. He couldn't understand why Dr. Williams, the doctor treating his baby, was acting so cold. Then he learned something tragic. Dr. Williams had lost her own child. She wasn't being mean on purpose. She was just scared, too afraid to care too much. The man standing beside Luke looked at Dr. Williams, his voice soft and pleading. "Sarah," he said, "you can't give up. I know you don't want to feel that pain again, but this baby needs you. If you don't try, you'll regret it forever." Dr. Williams shook her head, her voice breaking. "I can't go through that again." Luke felt a lump in his throat. He'd come in thinking doctor. Williams didn't care, but now he saw her pain ran far deeper than he could have imagined. But he couldn't ignore that his baby, so fragile and small, was running out of time. "Please," he said, barely able to keep his voice steady. "I know you're hurting, but I can't lose him. I already lost my sister. I have to save him, please." Surprised by his desperation, Dr. Williams met his gaze, her face softening as she glanced at the baby. After a moment's silence, she sighed and nodded. "All right, I'll try." Luke's heart leapt with both hope and fear. He could see the terror in Dr. Williams's eyes as she prepared for the surgery. She was terrified, her hands trembling slightly. The man at the door watched her, his eyes full of encouragement and worry. The surgery began, the room tense with the quiet beeps of the machines. Luke stood back, hands clenched tightly together, praying silently. But minutes into the operation, Dr. Williams grew tense, her hands moving faster. "His heart rate is dropping," she murmured, panic creeping into her voice. Luke's heart pounded. "What's happening?" he asked, but Dr. Williams didn't answer, focused solely on the baby's failing body. The machines beeped louder, filling the room with an ominous urgency. Dr. Williams whispered to herself, "Come on, don't give up now." But the worst sound broke through. The flatline. The baby's heart had stopped. Dr. Williams froze, her hands hovering over the tiny, lifeless body, her face full of shock and grief. "No," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. "No, this can't be happening." The man at the door took a step toward Dr. Williams, urgency in his voice. "Sarah, you can still bring him back." But Dr. Williams didn't respond. She was frozen, trapped in the nightmare of losing her own child. Luke's heart shattered. He felt like he couldn't breathe, but he knew this wasn't over. It couldn't be. He rushed to Dr. Williams, grabbing her arm. "Please, you can still save him. Don't give up now." She looked at him, her eyes distant, lost. I can't," she whispered. But Luke shook his head. "Yes, you can. You're not going to lose him." His words didn't seem to reach her at first, but then her gaze refocused, and she looked down at the baby with a flicker of determination. Dr. Williams took a steadying breath and turned to the nurse. "Start compressions." The nurse snapped into action, performing chest compressions on the tiny, fragile baby. Dr. Williams grabbed the defibrillator paddles, her hands shaking but steadying as she refocused. "Clear," she called, pressing the paddles to the baby's chest and sending a shock through the tiny body. Everyone held their breath, but the flat line remained. Luke's heart sank, but he forced himself to hold on to hope. He couldn't give up, not after everything he'd gone through. Dr. Williams's face was tense, her concentration unbreakable. "Clear." She shocked the baby again. The seconds dragged on painfully as Luke watched, praying with every fiber of his being. Dr. Williams's face was pale but resolute. She took another deep breath, almost like a prayer. "Clear." She administered the third shock, and for a moment, there was only silence. Luke's heart felt like it would shatter under the weight of it all. But then, a faint, weak blip. A tiny heartbeat flickered on the monitor. Luke's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the monitor, barely daring to believe it. The baby's heart had restarted, beating weakly but steadily. Luke sank into a chair, his legs finally giving out as he let the relief wash over him. "He's back," Dr. Williams whispered, her voice full of disbelief and wonder. Luke's eyes filled with tears, this time of overwhelming relief and joy. He looked up at Dr. Williams, who, for the first time, smiled. A small, tired smile, but real. The man at the door placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Sarah," he said softly. Dr. Williams glanced down at the baby, her eyes bright with tears. "I didn't do it alone," she murmured, meeting Luke's gaze. Luke managed a shaky smile, grateful beyond words. In that moment, he saw her not as the distant doctor he'd feared, but as a woman who had found the strength to care, to save. And he knew, in his heart, that he would never forget her. Luke's best friend had kept a huge secret. He never shared it, and now he was gone, leaving behind only his baby, tiny, weak, and barely alive. Luke felt his heart break. "Why didn't he come to me?" he whispered, tears in his eyes. "We could have figured it out together." Dr. Williams's ex-husband shook his head. "He didn't tell you because he didn't want to put you in danger. Those people wouldn't think twice about hurting anyone who got in their way, including you. He was trying to protect you." Luke sank into a chair, his mind racing. His best friend had sacrificed everything, even his own life, to keep Luke safe. And now, the baby, his friend's last connection to the world, needed someone. The responsibility was too much, but Luke knew deep down he couldn't just walk away. "I have to take care of him," Luke whispered, looking at the fragile baby. "I have to keep him safe." Dr. Williams stepped forward, her voice calm yet firm. "We're not going to let anything happen to him, Luke. We'll make sure he's safe. But he's too weak to move right now. We need to help him get stronger first." Luke nodded, his mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. But one stood out above the others. He had to protect this child. He couldn't let anything happen to him, not after what his best friend had done. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a nurse rushed in, looking scared. "Doctor, someone's here asking about the baby. They say they're family." Luke's heart stopped. Could it be those dangerous people? He felt a chill run down his spine. Dr. Williams looked pale as well, glancing at Luke. "Stay here. Don't let anyone take the baby," she ordered. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, and the door opened again. A tall man with a scar on his face stepped into the room, his dark eyes cold and intimidating. He wore a sharp black suit, but there was nothing friendly about him. "Where's the kid?" the man demanded, his voice low and threatening. Dr. Williams stepped in front of the baby, defiant. "Who are you?" The man gave a cold smile. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that the baby comes with me now." Luke's body filled with fear, but he stood firm. "No," he said, his voice shaking. "You're not taking him." The man looked at Luke, sizing him up. "So you're the one protecting him? Brave but foolish. You don't know who you're dealing with." Luke's heart pounded, but he didn't move. "I don't care who you are. You're not taking him." Dr. Williams's ex-husband spoke up, trying to sound tough. "This is a hospital. You don't belong here." The man laughed, cold and cruel. "I don't care about rules. I get what I want. And right now, I want that kid." Luke's fear grew as the man lunged forward, reaching for the baby. Dr. Williams tried to block him, but he shoved her aside. Her ex-husband tried to stop him too, but the man knocked him down. Without thinking, Luke grabbed the baby and ran out the door, his heart racing and his mind on one thing. He had to keep the baby safe. He sprinted down the hospital hallway, his legs burning as adrenaline pushed him forward. The man yelled behind him, but Luke didn't look back. He spotted a door to his right and burst through it, finding himself in a stairwell. He rushed down the stairs, holding the baby tightly. "We're going to be okay," he whispered, trying to reassure himself as much as the baby. "I won't let them get you." When he reached the bottom, he hesitated. The hospital basement was quiet and dimly lit, but it felt safer than the hallway. He could still hear the man's footsteps echoing above. His heart raced as he glanced around for an exit, finally spotting an emergency door at the end of the hallway. Without thinking, he pushed through it and stumbled outside into the cold night air. Luke kept running down the empty streets, searching for a place to hide. Across the street, he saw a narrow alley and ducked into it, pressing himself against the wall, breathing hard. The baby whimpered, and Luke gently hushed him. "It's okay," he whispered. "We're safe here, just for a minute." But he knew it wasn't true. The man was still out there, and sure enough, Luke soon heard footsteps echoing down the alley. "You can't hide forever, kid," the man called, his voice taunting. "I'll find you, and when I do, the baby's coming with me." Luke's heart pounded. He was scared, but he also felt something stronger: determination. He couldn't keep running. He had to face this man. Clutching the baby close, Luke stepped out of the shadows and stood in the middle of the alley. The man spotted him and smiled, cruel and cold. "There you are," he said, moving closer. "I told you I'd find you." Luke's fists clenched, but he stood his ground. "You're not taking him," he said, his voice shaking but steady. The man's smile widened. "You think you can stop me? You're just a kid." Luke's voice grew stronger. "I may be just a kid, but I'll do whatever it takes." For a moment, the man looked surprised, but his face quickly turned cold again. "This is your last chance, kid. Hand over the baby, or you're both going to get hurt." Just then, a loud shout echoed down the alley. "Stop right there." Luke turned and saw Dr. Williams, her ex-husband, and 2 security guards rushing toward them. The man's face twisted in anger. He looked like he wanted to fight, but he hesitated, glancing at the guards. Dr. Williams stepped forward, her voice strong. "Leave the baby alone. This ends now." The man glared at her but didn't move. After a tense moment, he sneered, "This isn't over. I'll be back, and next time, you won't be able to protect him." With that, he disappeared into the shadows. Luke sank to the ground, holding the baby close as relief washed over him. Dr. Williams knelt beside him, concern in her eyes. "Are you okay?" Luke nodded, still trembling. Yeah, I'm okay. Is the baby? Dr. Williams checked the baby and smiled. He's safe, thanks to you. Tears filled Luke's eyes as he looked at the baby, who was now calm and sleeping. Dr. Williams put a hand on his shoulder. You're not alone anymore, Luke. We'll help you, both of you. Luke looked down at the baby, feeling a mix of gratitude and hope. He had lost so much, but now he had something to hold on to, something to fight for.